I'm Micah Smith with Denver 7, and welcome to Denver Decides. This community partnership is dedicated to accessible and transparent elections. The partnership includes the League of Women Voters of Denver, Inter-Neighborhood Cooperation, and is presented by Denver 8 TV. Our mission today is to present a ballot issue forum in anticipation of the general election coming up on Tuesday, November 3rd. Among the numerous amendments and ordinance questions on this year's ballot is Denver Measure 2E. This measure asks voters if the charter of the City and County of Denver should be amended to give City Council authority to consent to certain mayoral appointments. Our format for this forum will follow a basic debate outline with opening and closing statements, cross-examination, and will include responses to questions submitted by the forum organizers. Let's begin by meeting the participants who will present and discuss the pros and cons of Referred Measure 2E. Beginning at my right is Councilwoman Amanda Sawyer, who represents Council District 5 on Denver City Council, and she will be speaking in favor of Referred Measure 2E. And on my left is Mr. Cole Finnegan, who served as both the city attorney and chief of staff for Mayor John Hickenlooper, and currently is the managing partner of the global law firm Hogan Lovells, and he will be speaking against Referred Measure 2E. Welcome to both of you. We will begin with 1 minute opening statements from both speakers. Councilwoman Sawyer, you're up first, speaking for Referred Measure 2E.
Thank you. Given all the unrest in our community, it's virtually impossible to find a thread of commonality among the different voices these days. With a single exception, the people of Denver are crying out for more transparency and accountability from their government. Referred Measure 2E to give City Council appointment authority of certain mayoral appointees, while not a cure-all for the many issues that face Denver, is a step towards bringing those values back to our local government. It's rooted in research, best practices, and good governance. It gives Denver residents better balance to their government. It builds community consensus around Denver's public safety positions. It safeguards against nepotism and unqualified appointees. It creates collaborative partnerships between council members and agencies. The policy makes sense. It's good governance. It's a policy that many other strong mayor cities follow successfully. It's what the people want, and it's time to bring it to Denver. Vote yes on 2E.
And now the opening statement from Cole Finnegan speaking against Referred Measure 2E.
Thank you, and thank you for having me tonight. While I applaud good government and certainly support government reforms, I think unfortunately this is a solution in search of a problem. And I regret to say that, but I've been involved in city government for a number of years. And while proponents argue that other cities and levels of government require the legislative branch to confirm executive branch appointments, I don't think that really makes sense in a city like Denver. They point to the U.S. Senate's role in presidential appointments, to the cabinet and judiciary, and we're seeing that right now with the Supreme Court. So do we think that process is working well? Do we think that's something that we should bring to Denver? Secondly, and I'll speak about this in more depth as we go on tonight, unfortunately, I think this will drive talent away. We're competing for the best talent around the nation to come work in city government. And I think if they face this kind of process, many people just simply will not apply.
And now, Mr. Finnegan, you will have 1 minute for a rebuttal to Councilwoman Sawyer's opening statement.
All right. Well, I would say that I think this is an idea that's well-intentioned, but does not work well. If you look over the 100 years that we've had a strong mayor system in Denver, it has worked well. Mayors Pena, Webb, Hickenlooper, and Hancock have done an excellent job. They have appointed responsible people. And again, as we compete for talent, and I think if you look at this process, we now will have to recruit people for these jobs, ask them to leave possibly excellent jobs that they have, and now be told that not only will they have to leave that job, but they now will face a 30-day period in which they possibly will be rejected. And at the end of that time, they will be without the job they left or without the job they sought. And I think once that becomes known, we will have an even harder time recruiting people to come work for our city.
Councilwoman Sawyer, you now have 1 minute for a rebuttal of Mr. Finnegan's opening statement.
Thank you. Opponents of this measure suggest that this is somehow a solution in search of a problem. They would have us believe that there's no need to change our charter because Denver's government functions perfectly, for no other reason than because it's existed this way for over 100 years. Take a look at what is happening in our city this summer, and you know that isn't the case. We are a community that is incredibly divided right now. We seem to only ever be given two polarized choices on any issue. And that's a false narrative, because our community works best when we find a balance between two sides. And I can tell you with 100% certainty that our government works best when we have balance. When our three branches share power and responsibilities, not necessarily equally, but when there are checks and balances the way our founding fathers intended. This policy brings some of that balance back. Thank you.
Now for our cross-examination rounds, beginning with Councilwoman Amanda Sawyer. You may ask Mr. Finnegan a question, and Cole, you will have 1 minute to reply.
Thank you.
This referred measure includes the city attorney, the manager of safety, the chiefs of police and fire, and the sheriff, including others. If it didn't, would you still oppose it?
Yes, I would. Because I believe, as I've said, and I'll continue to speak to this, I think it does not really improve our city government, and I do worry sincerely that it will bring some of the dysfunction that we see in the executive branch versus Congress in Washington. For 100 years, we've had a strong mayor form of government, and I think that has worked well for us, particularly the last 35 years, where Denver has become one of the great cities in America. And if I thought that the quality of the appointees of the mayor in some way affected how well our city functioned, I would look at this more closely. But again, in this instance, I think it will be problematic, and I think not only will we lose good people, we will have people who never apply who would be terrific, and they just simply will not want to be part of this process.
Now, Mr. Finnegan, you may ask Councilwoman Sawyer a question, and Amanda, you will have 1 minute for your response.
Thank you. So my question is, given the difficulty council currently has at times in maintaining decorum with one another and some of the issues that we've seen in recent months, frankly, as our city has struggled in terms of council members perhaps cursing or berating city employees in hearings, how can we ensure that good people are not scared away from public service in a political process that will involve 13 distinctive and different personalities?
Well, it's a good question, but we have decorum rules. They exist in city council for a reason, and they are enforced. They are meant to be there. Additionally, there is a process in place that is written into this law. The process includes a council, the council committee. So if a council member wants to question an appointee who is going to be up for a position, that actually doesn't happen in chambers. It goes to the committee, right? What's supposed to happen is that all of that work happens on the back end. So if you can't get 7 members of a 13-member council to approve this person to begin with, they probably shouldn't have the job to begin with. And if a council member wants to interview someone, they can do that in the council committee. And that's where that's supposed to happen, and that's where that does happen. So there isn't some dramatic interrogation on the floor.
Let's continue with cross-examination, and this time, Cole, you will again have a chance to ask Amanda a question, and Amanda, you will have 1 minute to reply.
Thank you. A question I do have is, can you point to a pattern of past mayors or the current mayor nominating candidates that are not qualified to serve?
That's a good question. And I think that we are super lucky, particularly in the appointees that we have today. Our city is in a crisis, and our appointees have all stepped up and done a fantastic job in that crisis today. But our charter is a document that is our guiding document it has been for the past 100 years and will be forevermore. And this is a good governance principle that other strong mayor cities do, that our state level government does, that our federal government does, that is a set of guardrails that make sense for our community to ensure that there is collaboration, to ensure that there is no nepotism, to ensure that there are always qualified appointees that are in our city. And so if there's never been a problem before, what's the harm in doing this now? Thank you.
Now, Amanda, you may ask Cole a question, and Cole, you will have 1 minute to respond.
Thank you.
Municipal voter turnout in Denver has historically been very low, often with less than a third of the city's population choosing their elected officials. Doesn't this process ensure better representative government by including more voter voices through their independently elected city council members?
I don't think it does. While I think that we do need greater voter participation, particularly in municipal elections, I don't think there's any evidence that this really would engage more voters to be in the process. What I worry about is what would happen is we would have people who, again, leave jobs or believe that they have a job, come in, and now they're subjected to 13 different people who may have very different agendas. And while everyone may have good intentions, sometimes they don't have good intentions, or they may have issues with the mayor or issues with the person. I think back to former Police Chief White, who left his position in Louisville and came to Denver, and it was very problematic and clear that it was difficult for him in leaving the job in Louisville. So I think what would have happened if he left Louisville, came here, couldn't reach confirmation, and suddenly he's left without a job, and we've lost a terrific person.
Next round, Amanda, you will go first with your next question for Cole.
Okay. So this is a process that's used in other strong mayor cities. It's used in Colorado state government. It's used at the federal level. Why should the mayor of Denver enjoy more appointment power than the governor or the president of the United States of America?
Well, when this was done now many decades ago, the people of Denver looked at this and decided that a strong mayor system of government would work well. And I can speak to this because I served as the chief legal counsel for Governor Romer many years ago and as the director of policy, and then later worked for Mayor Hickenlooper as the city attorney and as the chief of staff. And in my mind, the mayor of Denver had so much more authority and could get things done, and there was one person who was accountable. So the people knew that there was one person in charge in Denver and who selected the people that worked for him or her, eventually there will be a her, and that those people were responsible. So there was no diffusion of power or responsibility. So I think in this instance, and again, I would say, if you look at what's going on in Washington, that is a dysfunctional system. I don't see any need to bring it to Denver.
Now, Cole, your next question for Amanda.
We've talked about the process and how it would work. A question I do have is, how would you convince a legitimate contender for a position to subject herself to a process where there's going to be a 30-day delay before the job could actually be confirmed and she would have the job?
Well, there wouldn't necessarily be a 30-day delay, right? Because the process is that this should go through on consent. So, theoretically, if this person is qualified, if this person has the support of 7 council members, then as soon as the bill is filed, or the resolution is filed, that means it's one vote, and then they should be appointed and there shouldn't be a problem because they have the support of a majority of council members. No problems. It doesn't necessarily need to be 30 days. There's a 30-day shot clock, just like a standard resolution. However, even if this person was going to go into the private sector in a new job, if they were going to be the CEO of a company, they would have to go in front of a search committee and interview. They would have to be approved by a board of directors. They would have to, interview and report with someone. It's not like they're going to stay in the job that they are in forever. And it's not like just because they're going to be coming to a government job, they're going to be somehow more accountable than in some other job.
That brings us to our final cross-examination round. And Cole, you will start it off with a question for Amanda. And Amanda, you will have 1 minute to answer.
In listening to the councilwoman with these pieces of information in terms of looking in this, a question I have is when you are out speaking to people, do you find this to be a common concern? Because I don't recall this really being a common concern when I was involved in government.
I'm glad you asked that question because I do. I hear it all the time. And you said something earlier that was so startling to me, and it was so interesting. You said that the mayor has consolidated power and that there is one person with all of the power. And that is incredibly startling because that's not the way government is supposed to function. Government is supposed to have balance to it. And through your own words and your own discussion, you admitted that Denver City's government doesn't have that balance to it. And that is what's missing here. This is not a cure-all for that, but it is an incremental step that will help bring some of that back and help our government be more representative, which is something I hear people in our city asking for all the time. Yes.
And Amanda, your final question for Cole. Cole, again, you will have 1 minute for your answer.
My final question for you is, what existing language in the city charter prevents against nepotism, prevents against unqualified appointments, and prevents against a consolidation of power?
Well, I don't have the city charter in front of me, but I don't recall language specifically to that, although I would say I can't recall any incidents of nepotism. And we spoke just a moment ago about the consolidation of power, and I don't think that I said it was precisely the mayor held all the power. What I said was the mayor is accountable. The mayor is the one person people look to. And again, if you look at the way the city and county of Denver has functioned in the past 30 years, that has worked well for us. And there's really, I don't think, been any examples you provided me tonight of an abuse of that or a situation where we would get better people because of this process. I continue to believe strongly that we will not get as good candidates to apply for these jobs, and that will weaken our city government because we won't have the best people in these positions because they simply won't want to go through this process.
Our next couple of rounds will feature our speakers responding to questions submitted by our forum organizers. Each speaker will answer each question, and they will have 1 minute for their answers. Councilwoman Amanda Sawyer, who is here speaking in support of Referred Measure 2E, you will be first to answer. The concept of council confirmation has pros and cons. Would it be wise to reject this charter amendment now and refile it for a public vote when City Council has established its own stability and credibility?
I think City Council has established its own stability and credibility, so no. And I think probably the best example of that is this charter amendment. So I have actually spent hundreds of hours researching this charter amendment over the last year. And what is amazing about this charter amendment is that when it finally was referred to the ballot by city council members, it was referred on consent. It was never even discussed the night it was referred to the ballot. And that is because we spent so much time going back and forth on it. We spent so many hours researching it. I spent so many hours getting feedback, negative feedback from my council members, and then having to go back and fix it or change it or research and come back with answers, that by the time we actually voted on it on the night of, it went through unanimously and on consent with no discussion.
And now Mr. Cole Finnegan, who is here speaking against Referred Measure 2E, your response to that question.
Well, obviously, I think it would be better if it was set aside for now. I don't think there's, again, any burning need for this. And I would say, if you look at some of the conversations that have gone on and you look at reality and how this works, we have state laws, for example, that when people apply for certain jobs, such as the presidency at the University of Colorado or at the Denver Public Schools superintendency, that we have over the years noticed that candidates drop out because as they get put in the final pool of 3 and they suddenly understand that it will be public knowledge that they are candidates for these jobs and that they may not be chosen and that their current employer might not view that in a favorable light, they drop out. So what you've seen repeatedly in recent times in the real world is that we end up with only one candidate because the other people drop out.
Next question from our organizers for our guests, and Mr. Finnegan, you will respond first. You have 1 minute to answer. Why shouldn't the mayor be able to appoint whomever he pleases without checks and balances?
Well, the mayor, I think, should be able to appoint who he thinks is the best person. And again, it's a system that's worked well for many, many years. We also have a very vigorous public process in Denver, and I can speak in my 33 years of being involved in the civic environment here that there's no lack of scrutiny from the media and from the political world and from the civic community as to how people are doing in their jobs. So think of the mayor as the CEO who's appointed to help run the city, and these are the people who work with him and then also work in consultation with the council and other branches of government. But they're accountable, and certainly the public lets the mayor know and lets the government know when someone is struggling or is not the right person for the job. And I think the mayor or the mayors over the years that I've seen have certainly stepped in and relieved people of their jobs if they weren't getting them done.
And now, Councilwoman Sawyer, your response to that question.
Can you repeat the question one more time?
Why shouldn't the mayor be able to appoint whomever he pleases without checks and balances?
Well, right now he can. And that is the purpose of a strong mayor system. And this still allows that, right? There is nothing in this law that says that the mayor can't choose any appointee that he wants. There's nothing that stops the mayor from going through an entire process and choosing the person they want for the appointee. All this law says is that whoever that person is, when the mayor finally chooses, he's got to make sure that a majority of council also buys in for that person. So this law doesn't actually change any of that. Doesn't change that structure at all. And that's why I say that it's respectful of the strong mayor system, because the mayor gets to continue that process in exactly the same way that occurs right now. All this does is says he's also got to get the buy-in of 7 members of council.
Let's continue with questions submitted by our forum organizers. And Amanda, you will respond first and have 1 minute for your response. What are some examples of mayoral cabinet appointees who have been controversial?
That is a great question and a difficult one to answer. I think probably the most current situation we have today of mayoral cabinet appointees that are controversial are not appointees who exist in the position today. It is appointees where there have been gaps for significant periods of time. So for example, for 2 years, the city of Denver went without a head of community planning and development. 2 years we went without a head of community planning and development. In that 2-year period of time, we created an entire NPI process. The entire Denverite plan was created, an entire city planning process where we supposedly discussed the direction of our city planning for the entire future of our city. But there was no head of the community planning and development department. That's a problem.
And now, Cole, your response to that question.
Well, first of all, I'll date myself if I really think about some of the people who've been controversial, and I would probably have to go back several decades. But I think this question underscores my point. The example that Councilwoman Sawyer gives would not be cured by this charter amendment. The fact that there was a gap in someone being appointed would not be cured because City Council had the right to approve or reject a candidate. I don't know the particulars of that issue, but obviously, for some reason, no one was appointed. So I don't think that would help. And again, as I said in my earlier response, there are occasionally people who struggle in their jobs or are controversial. And I think if you look at the history of Denver, particularly over the last couple of decades, those people have been replaced either under public pressure or pressure from the mayor and moved on, and other people brought in.
And that brings us to the end of our Q&A segment, and we now move to closing statements. Each speaker will have 1 minute for a closing statement, and we will reverse the order of the opening statements, which means we will begin with Mr. Cole Finnegan. You have 1 minute for your closing statement.
Thank you, and thank you again for the opportunity to be part of this debate tonight. I think it's great that we have these conversations in Denver. This is such a wonderful city, and I think all of us want to make the city better, and I certainly know there's positive intent behind an amendment like this. Based upon my years in government and involvement at the federal level, the local level, and the state level, I simply don't think this is a problem. And I think this is, again, a solution in search of a problem. And while I commend the intent behind it, I don't think it's practical, and I think it will harm our city because, as I said repeatedly tonight, I think good people who would apply and be excellent public servants would have pause if they knew they had to go through this kind of process. I think back when I became the city attorney, I don't know what I would have done if I knew I had to deal with 30 days and 13 different city council members. But thank you again for the opportunity to be here tonight.
And now a closing statement from Councilwoman Amanda Sawyer. You have 1 minute for your closing statement.
Well, thank you again for having me tonight. This has been really wonderful, and it was such a pleasure to meet you in person finally. You know, I want to also just go back to our discussion really quickly and remind everyone that there is a reasonable time requirement in this bill, written into this bill. So in fact, it would cure the problem of a 2-year opening. And I can understand the concerns of those who've enjoyed the benefits of consolidated power for 100 years. But these small incremental changes make a difference. And instituting a process that brings more balance and transparency and accountability to our strong mayor system, but still honors the will of the people and is respectful to our charter and its original structure, it makes sense. It's good governance. Other than our mayor and his supporters, there doesn't seem to be any formal opposition to this at all. So I'm asking you to support it. And if you'd like to find out more information, go to www.yeson2e.org. Thank you.
On behalf of the forum organizers, I'd like to thank both of you for your participation in this forum. We hope we've given you a fair look at the pro and con arguments for referred measure 2E. Again, this measure asks voters if the charter of the city and county of Denver should be amended to give city council authority to consent to certain mayoral appointments. Our thanks also to the Denver Decides partners, which include Interneighborhood Cooperation and the League of Women Voters of Denver. Denver Decides is presented by Denver 8 TV. Remember, Election Day is Tuesday, November 3rd. Let your voice be heard, be sure you are registered, and be sure to vote. For complete election information online, go to denverdecides.org. I'm Micah Smith with Denver 7. Thanks for joining us.